Hi everybody, in this video I'm going to show you how to calculate the variance and standard deviation. If we go over to number 8 on homework number 1, this is where we're asked about variance and standard deviation. So we're going to look at an example that is really similar to the ones in number 8. So our example is going to consist of data based on the hours of streaming that people reported. I'm just going to go ahead and provide us with some data to work with. Let's say that we asked 6 or so people about their streaming habits, and we asked them how many hours per day they spend streaming, and these are the numbers that we got. So one person said 7 hours a day, another person said they don't watch any streaming, one person said an hour, another person said 3 hours, let's say another person said 2, and then finally someone said 5 hours. This would mean that we have an N of 6. N stands for sample size, and so N equals 6. The first step in calculating the variance and standard deviation is to find the mean. So let's go ahead and do that. The mean is also known as and symbolized by Y bar. Our textbook uses Y bar. Other textbooks use X bar. So if you ever do see X bar, just know that it does mean the same thing as Y bar. So let's go ahead and find Y bar, the mean. We're going to pull our calculator out here. The formula for the mean is sigma Y. The sigma stands for the sum of. So we're just going to sum of the Y scores, and then the rest of the formula is divided by N. So sigma Y divided by N. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Add up our scores. 7 plus 0 plus 1 plus 3 plus 2 plus 5 gets us 18. So sigma Y so far is 18. And remember, we have to divide it by N. And in this case, it's 6. So we have 18 divided by 6. And that comes out to 3. What are we looking at again? We're looking at hours of streaming. So the average hours streamed by this group was 3 hours. That's the first step. We have to find the average before we can do the next part, which is our flow chart. So the flow chart is going to help us find the deviations of each of our Y scores. So the flowchart starts off with the column Y. Y is our scores for from our data, and then the second column is going to consist of Y minus Y bar. This second column is our deviations. So just a quick primer on deviations themselves. What a deviation is basically the difference between your score and the mean. So for example, this first person said they watched 7 hours. So what's their deviation? So deviation is difference between your score and the mean. So the difference between 7 and the mean is 4 hours. So 7 and 3. If we were to find the difference between the two, it would be 4 hours. And so that's pretty much exactly what we're going to do in this flowchart. So we're going to find all the deviations. So our first score is Y. The first score is 7. So we're going to do 7 minus 3. So in this case, we get 4. Our next value is 0, and so forth and so forth. Make sure to include the negatives. So 0 minus 3 gets us negative 3. Next score is 1. 1 minus 3 gets us negative 2. If you're right on the mean, your deviation is 0. And this is what happens with our next score. The person who watches 3 hours, when we find their deviation, 3 minus 3, that comes out to 0. So then the next person watched 2 hours. Their deviation, 2 minus 3 equals negative 1. The next person watches 5 hours. 5 minus 3 comes out to 2. So we have a list of our deviations, and if we were to try to sigma them up, meaning sum them up, something really interesting would happen. So let's see what would happen. You can go ahead and try to sum these up on your own as well. So sigma, that's the symbol for sigma. Add these up. 4 plus -3 plus -2 plus 0. Let's just go ahead and throw that one in there anyways. Plus -1 plus 2 comes out to 0. So this is the dilemma that we find ourselves in, because when we try to add up all of our deviations, it comes out to 0, right? And we can't really do anything with 0, so we have to create a third column. In this third column, we're just going to square the deviations. So this is the third and final column for this flowchart, and it is the squared deviations column. So we have squared deviations, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take the number from our second column, deviation, and square it to get squared deviations. So our first deviation was 4. 4 squared comes out to 16. Next is -3. -3 squared comes out to +9. So notice that this is getting rid of all the negatives so that we don't have any more negatives that are going to add up to 0 this time. Now when we add up or sigma our squared deviations, we actually get a positive number. So adding these up, 16 plus 9 plus 4 plus 1 plus 4 comes out to 34. So the sum of my squared deviations is equal to 34. Okay, so I fast forwarded a little bit and wrote out the variance formula. Now that we have the squared deviations and the sum of squared deviations, we can find the variance. So the variance, the definition of the variance, by the way, is the average squared deviation. So it doesn't have a whole lot of meaning to it. It's just a means to an end. So we do the variance formula first, and that's going to help us get the standard deviation, which is the really meaningful number, the number that we actually want. But we have to find the variance first, so let's go ahead and do that. This is the variance formula, like I mentioned. This is the symbol that we use for the variance. Sometimes you'll just see s squared, so just be aware of that. But usually you'll see the s squared and sub y. Anyways, at the top you have sigma y minus y bar squared. So that should look familiar to you because we just did that in our third column of our flowchart. So we quite literally just need to copy that number, the sum of squared deviations, for that part of the formula. So we have 34. This is where I got that 34 from our previous step. This would be step 3, by the way. And then the bottom part of the variance formula is n minus 1. So that part's pretty easy too, because we know that n is 6 and 6 minus 1 is 5. So now all we have to do is find 34 divided by 5, and that comes out to 6.8. So this is my average squared deviation. So quite literally, you know, what this means is that people were, on average, 6.8 squared hours away from the mean. So it really doesn't tell us a whole lot of really useful information. Like I said, it's a step that we take in order to find the standard deviation. So let's go ahead and move over to that steps. This is the last step, and to find standard deviation, which, by the way, is the average deviation from the mean. So in other words, if we were to take all of the deviations from the mean and find the average, that's what our standard deviation represents. And I'll talk a little bit more about its meaning and its significance here in a bit once we actually calculate it. So the last step is to find the standard deviation. All we have to do is square root the variance. So the formula for standard deviation is really simple because it's we just use the letter S to signify standard deviation, and then we're quite literally going to square root the variance. So the formula is just that. We write out a radical sign, and we're going to square root the variance. So looking at our variance, we got a variance of 6.8. So we're just going to find the square root of 6.8 and we'll be done. So 6.8, and that gets square rooted. Oops. 6.8 gets square rooted, and we get 2.6. So now we have a real answer, 2.6 hours away from the mean. So let's talk a little bit about what this means exactly. It's a really useful number. The standard deviation is the average deviation from the mean. So you can kind of think of this as normal variation. So if you're within 2.6 hours, you're within a normal range of the mean. Notice that the standard deviation is different from the mean. This does not mean that on average we're watching 2.6 hours of streaming per day. Not at all. The average, we already have that. The average is, we found, 3 hours. So on average, people are watching within 2.6 hours of streaming from the average of 3 hours. So if you're kind of within that standard deviation, that means that you're within the normal range. So think about this in terms of test scores. If the average test score is a 90 and the standard deviation is 5, that means that if you're within 5 points of 90, you're within a normal range. Anything outside of that kind of exceeds normality. So let's say you score a 99, that means you're outside of the normal range and you're scoring, pretty high. Same thing in the other direction. If the average is 90, standard deviation is 5, and you're scoring a 75, you're well below that normal range of what is considered the standard deviation. So it's a really useful number. It kind of helps us figure out what's a normal range to be within. And so that kind of summarizes what it is. So just to recap, we looked at hours of streaming, and the first thing we want to do is find the mean. Second thing we want to do is create this flowchart to make everything nice and organized. At the end of this flowchart, we're going to get the sum of squared deviations. That goes into our variance formula, and then our variance formula goes into the standard deviation formula, and lastly we explain the number that we got. So if you have any questions, just let me know, but hopefully that helps you out a little bit, and I'll talk to you next time.